Hello everyone, welcome. This is the Devonshires webinar on the draft consumer standards consultation, and I'm joined today by Angela Holden. She is the Assistant Director of Consumer Regulation at the Regulator of Social Housing, and my name is Donna McCarthy. I'm Head of Housing Management and Property Litigation at Devonshires. So, what are we up to today? This will run up to 12 o'clock, very much driven by questions and anything you want to know. The way the session will run is I'm going to do a very quick introduction, and then Angela has done all the hard work. She's put together a presentation. I can't see you, but hopefully you can see us. You're all automatically muted on these sessions, but we communicate via the Q&A button. So please do feel free to type questions into the Q&A, and then Angela and I can pick those up towards the end of the session. So the purpose of today is really, this is what's one of our Flash Friday sessions here at Devonshires. So this is hopefully going to help you navigate the consultation document and look at the changes that are proposed. And I think the really important thing to stress is the word consultation. These things are not set in stone. And I know when we did the TSMs session, there were lots of things that came out of that did influence what the final TSMs look like. Today is really about information sharing, and Angela particularly giving you some insight as to the proposed changes and say the consultation process itself. I think that what would be really good is that we will follow this up with a round table, maybe in 4 to 6 weeks, where you can go away, digest, have a think about it, and then come back and we can share some ideas and thoughts as part of the process of individual organisations putting their responses forward. So how we've got here, this is been a really long journey. Following the Grenfell tragedy, there was very much a sharp focus on engagement with residents, improving the condition of homes, and the social housing green and then social housing white papers set us on course for some quite significant changes, of which this is part. The legislative power for this comes from the Social Housing Regulation Act, which has 3 objectives: to facilitate a new proactive consumer regulation regime, to refine the existing economic regulation regime, to strengthen regulatory powers, to enforce both the economic and consumer regimes. So obviously with sounds a bit like Spider-Man, with great power comes a need for some new consumer standards that will help the regulator do their job of being proactive and actually driving forward the standards that are required in order to give effect to the Social Housing Act. So in a nutshell, the consultation has 4 proposed new consumer standards. They are called safety and quality, transparency, influence and accountability, neighbourhood and community, and tenancy. And 2 of those will sound familiar, but there are still some smaller changes proposed. You will find those in Annex 1. There is 1 code of practice, and this, I think, is something that landlords will welcome. It's not binding, but you will have to have regard to it when you're looking at the standards. And one of the things that I've found is often landlords will say they would really appreciate a bit more of a steer as to what practical things can be done to ensure compliance. And I think the code of practice will be welcome, but again, read it, digest it, think about, are there unintended consequences? Will this actually help landlords do the job? There are 9 consultation questions. And the response to those questions is due by the 17th of October. So we've got plenty of time, which is why I think a round table, once you've gone away, digested it, would be helpful. The consultation will not deliver a complete suite of new consumer standards. There is going to be more to come, because this is like fitting together a jigsaw. For example, tenancy standard cannot be revised effectively until the renters reform legislation is in place. So I'm going to hand over to Angela, who's going to tell you this in much more detail. But I always think it's nice to give you a navigation tool, because this is all new. I anticipate many of you on the session today will not have opened it yet. But I think keep in mind through this session, it is a consultation. Questions, queries are welcome, both in respect of the responses to the document itself and today, just to help you get your thought processes going. And I always think it's really important to think about unintended consequences. And one of the things that I find is sometimes the best draftsmanship in the world, actually practical operational experience may throw up scenarios that will make that drafting not deliver what it's intended to achieve. So I think it's really important just to have your practical operational heads on when you're looking at this as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Angela, who is going to take you through the consultation.
Thank you, Donna, for the introduction as well. It's really helpful, I think, to sort of set the scene for where we're going. And thank you all for attending. I mean, high numbers of attendance anyway, I think shows the real interest that there is in this consultation and in what's in the consumer standards. And we're really excited about it. It's been a long process for us as a regulator. We've spoken to an awful lot of stakeholders in getting to this point as well. And I'll talk more about the consultation itself, but as Donna said, you know, that really is a genuine opportunity for people to feedback. We really want people to tell us what they think, and we want these standards to work for the sector. We don't want to set the sector up to fail. So I'll talk you through the different elements of it anyway. I'll talk you through a brief bit on the context, although I would imagine that is fairly well understood by the people on this webinar already. We'll talk about consumer standards, what are the key changes, talk about the code of practice, as Donna said, and have a think about what the intention of that code of practice is. I'll talk you through the consultation process, and then a slight change, but I wanted also to talk to you about the lessons from the pilot inspections that we've been carrying out as well. And I think because that links, because that's what the new consumer standards will be what we will assess against in the new world from April 2024 onwards. So there's some lessons from there that you might find helpful in thinking about the standards and in thinking about how you prepare to meet the standards as well. And really hoping we'll get a good amount of time for questions and discussion following the presentation. So Donna set out the context, green paper, white paper, now the bill. I think for us and for the sector as a whole, it really has been a very long time in coming. You know, it's been a work in progress for a long time. I know when I've been doing various speaking events and I've sort of had to add up over time, saying it's been 6 months since the white paper, 12 months since the white paper. Yeah, we're now 2.5 years since the white paper, so it has been a considerable amount of time. And I think, you know, obviously the origins of the green paper was the tragic fire at Grenfell, and since then there have also been some other, you know, really significant and tragic events within the sector that has sort of sharpened people's focus, I think, around what is the sector here for, what is the sector delivering, and for us as a regulator as well, you know, what is our regulation delivering through this. So all of that is driving a proactive regulation of the consumer standards from April 2024. I can tell you that feels like a long way away, but I get a dashboard of the progress we're making on implementation, and I see those days ticking down every single day. So it will come quickly. April really isn't very far away. And I think, you know, making sure that you use this time, one, to feedback on the consultation. I'll tell you about how you can do that, but also thinking about, is your organisation prepared to meet those standards as well, and how you'll evidence that is really, really important. So just a little bit on how we've developed the consumer standards and sort of our starting point. I think for us, we have been really conscious that there was a lot of stuff in the existing standards that was good, and we didn't want to throw out what was good about those standards, but they had been in place for a long time. Some of them have been in place for more than 10 years. And I think, things have changed, the sector has changed, tenants' expectations have rightly changed of their landlords as well. So we've tried to keep the bits that worked and the bits that we thought were most appropriate, but we have changed them, and we have tried to modernise them and update them and really fit with individuals' expectations. I think what we have also been really conscious of is retaining that outcome-based focus that we've already got in our standards. So for those of you who've already looked at them, and for when you are looking at the draft standards, they are deliberately high level in most places. There are some bits that are more prescriptive than others, but they are deliberately high level. We don't really want to tell landlords specifically how you do things. This is not tick box regulation. This is really about thinking about, from your perspective, how do you deliver it within the context of your organisation and your tenants? You will know your organisation and your tenants best. So we've focused on outcomes, and how you get there will be for you to determine. And the primary relationship really remains between landlords and tenants. And we've been talking about that for a long time. I think as a regulator, we want to make sure that that relationship is working well, but we don't have any desire to substitute ourselves in between that relationship. How you manage your services and how you deliver your services to your tenants is primary, really. We put 3 tests for consumer regulation, for delivering the new consumer regulation on ourselves. And the first one is that it has to make a meaningful difference to tenants. If it's not making a meaningful difference to tenants, then there's no point in any of us doing this. So we really want it to be a step change for how tenants engage with their landlords and how they receive services from their landlords. So we do want it to make a meaningful difference to tenants. The other big test for us, and particularly how this cuts across with the consultation, is it has to be deliverable by landlords. I said earlier, we don't want to set any landlord up to fail. We don't want to set the sector up to fail. We want to ask you to do things that are reasonable and that fit with your core purpose as a landlord. But we want you to be able to do that. We don't want to set something that is impossible for the sector to deliver. So I'm hoping that you'll see that in the standards when you come to look at them. And for us, the third test for us is that we have to be able to regulate them effectively, which I think again speaks to that outcome-focused standards for us. It's not about us seeing a tick box. It's all about, can we see the outcomes that you're delivering for tenants? So this is really just a bit of an outline of how we got there in terms of developing the draft standards ourselves. So we've talked to an awful lot of stakeholders over a considerable period of time. During that period, we've talked to the sector. We've talked to lots of landlords. We've talked to landlord groupings, and representative bodies as well. We talked to tenants. I think we're up at more than 2,000 tenants that we've talked to about the standards and what they think should be in them as well. And really pulling that work together has given us the principles and the themes for our work. And that was how we developed the themes for the 4 standards that we are working on. Internally, then we reviewed the existing standards and we thought about what was good, what was working, what was out of date, what needed to change. And we used that really to inform our next steps. We tried to link that then with the white paper, the social housing white paper expectations and the directions that we are given. So some of our standards, we have limited ability to influence. So some of it we are directed by government on certain areas, and we've tried to capture that within the documents themselves as well. We developed drafts of the consumer standards, and we have then carried out an equality impact assessment and a regulatory impact assessment as well, because we're really conscious that us developing draft standards doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it will affect how you receive them, how you implement them as providers, and that they potentially have impacts on different people and different groups of tenants and different groups of organisations in slightly different ways. So we have carried out that equality impact assessment as well. We tested some of this with key stakeholders, relatively small amounts, I think it's fair to say, but we have done some testing of where we've got to and done some further refinement of it. But that's what's taken us to this consultation today. And I think from our perspective, we really want this to be a significant consultation. We really want a wide range of responses. We want people to be involved in giving us their views, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. So these are the standards, these are the draft standards as they currently are, and I'll just say a little bit about each of them and what they sort of cover. There will be, as Donna said, some overlap. So you'll see there is a neighbourhood and community standard and there is a tenancy standard. The other two standards, safety and quality, and transparency, influence and accountability standards, are quite new. Although you'll see, for those of you who are familiar with our current standards, you'll see a good deal of overlap with the home standard and the tenant involvement and empowerment standard. But I'll just talk to each of the standards briefly, just so you know what to expect within them. So the first one is safety and quality standard. And as I say, that has a really strong link with our existing home standard. You'll see within it, there are some things that are aligned with our current home standards. So there's things around an effective repair service, adaptations, decent home compliance. But I think what is different in this standard is a greater focus on quality than we've maybe had before. I'm hoping that is for pretty obvious reasons for those of you in the sector. One of the things that we are really pushing on is you understanding the detail of your stock. And that includes stock at an individual property level. So really understanding what your homes are, what your homes need, making sure that you've got regular surveys of those, you know, and allowing that to inform the decisions that you make, and allowing that to inform how you meet decent homes compliance, how you respond when tenants contact you for repairs. So that is the big change within that. Obviously, we've retained decent home standard compliance within that part of the standard as well. You'll be aware that the decent home standard compliance is the decent home standard is currently under review. We don't own the DHS standard, but we do regulate against it. So when the government has finalised their proposals for the new DHS, then we will be able to continue to regulate against it as we do now. There's focus on health and safety compliance. That's already a significant part of our work. But we are quite a bit more specific in terms of, it's not just about delivering certain checks, but you have to follow up and manage the risks, carry out the actions that arise from it as well. So a little bit more specific on what health and safety compliance looks like. And our emphasis around repairs has changed a little bit. So in our current standard, we talk about having a cost-effective repair service. We've changed that in this standard. Our proposal is that the repair service is effective, and we've allowed some scope within that for you to sort of set your own timescales for carrying out repairs, and to do that in conjunction with tenants. But we really want to see that repair service is delivering what it needs to deliver for your tenants. And then there's a bit on adaptations, and in particular how you work with other third parties to deliver adaptations that your tenants need. So that's the first one. The second standard that we've got is the transparency, influence and accountability standard. And that you will see when you read it, links quite closely with our current tenant involvement and empowerment standard. Really for us, this is all about that kind of engagement that you have with your tenants and what that looks like. So there's quite a lot in there around treating your tenants with fairness and respect, and understanding the diverse needs of your tenants and making sure that you're delivering equitable outcomes for tenants. One of the things that we've been seeing in pilot inspections, and one of the things that we've been talking to the sector about, is really understanding what your tenants need, who lives behind the door of your properties, how you make adjustments for tenants who need them, to deliver equitable outcomes. And I think you could expect us in our inspections to spend more time focusing on that kind of outcome for tenants, and for you to be able to evidence those outcomes as well. There's also then information about services, which is really about how you talk to your tenants about what you're delivering, how transparent you are with tenants about your services, and to support them in effective scrutiny. So the TSMs are covered in that part of the standard as well. And then a focus on complaints as well. And again, we've changed some of our expectations around complaints. We've tried to align them with the Housing Ombudsman's expectations around complaints as well, because we're really mindful about not asking the sector to do to meet two different standards, but a real focus on complaints and using complaints to drive improvements. The third standard, as we said, will look reasonably familiar to most of you, I would have thought. So the neighbourhood and community standard, we talked again about the maintenance of shared spaces, making sure that the areas in which you operate are good from an economic and a social perspective, and that you're contributing to the neighbourhoods in which you operate. We've talked about safer neighbourhoods. That came across in a lot of the green paper conversations that were had around making sure that neighbourhoods are safe and that you're contributing to that. Things like managing antisocial behaviour as well. The big change in this standard for us as a regulator is the bit on domestic abuse. We've previously never regulated against any kind of action that landlords take in relation to domestic abuse. The new legislation will require us to do that. So within the standard, there is something about making sure that you have a policy that shows how you will work with others and the support you will offer to people who are victims of domestic abuse. And there is also something in there about the support that you will offer to victims and to try and tackle domestic abuse where you can. Although we recognise that that is not solely a landlord responsibility, it is part of your responsibility. So that's in there for the first time. And the tenancy standard is perhaps the one that has changed the least at this point. There are still some changes, but we are directed by government on quite a lot of this, and we are waiting still for some direction around certain aspects of this. But the standard itself talks about allocations and lettings and how you allocate your properties in a fair way. It talks about tenancy sustainment and eviction, so helping your tenants to maintain their tenancies and the support that you offer there. And then there are also requirements around tenure and mutual exchange, which is where we're directed by government. So there's quite a lot in those standards. I'm hoping that will help give you a bit of a feel for what's in there if you've not had a chance to look at them just yet. I'll talk briefly about code of practice then as well. So this is the first time that we've been able to issue a code of practice for the consumer standards. We've got codes of practice on the economic standards for the governance and financial viability standard and for the value for money standard. But previously we weren't allowed by law to issue a code of practice for the consumer standards. And that has changed now, which we really welcome. And as Donna said in her introduction, we're hoping that the sector will find this a useful document. It elaborates on some of the requirements within the standards, so we try and give examples of things. They are not exhaustive. We don't pretend that the examples that we give are exhaustive. They might not fit exactly with your organisation and the services that you deliver, but we're trying to illustrate and to give a bit more detail about some of the requirements in the standards and to amplify some of what we mean, so to expand a little bit on what we mean. The drafting in the standards by design is relatively sparse, so we're hoping the code of practice will give you a bit more amplification of what we mean. What we're not trying to prescribe through this is how providers comply with the standards. So we might give an example. That's not to say that you have to deliver your service in exactly that way. We wouldn't want to be that prescriptive, but it's just to give you an illustration of how you might go about it if that fits and if that was right for your tenants and for your organisation. But really what we're trying to do is help you to understand what we're looking for. So when we come to you and we're doing our inspection or we're doing a piece of reactive engagement with you, we might ask you for some evidence that shows that you're meeting one of the standards, and that might help you to understand what we're looking for and what kind of assurance you can give to us as well. So we want providers to use the code. We want providers to be able to think about what the code means for them and to help them to implement the consumer standards. We can't enforce against the code. So if you're not meeting a specific expectation in the code, we can't make you do that. So our enforcement powers won't make you meet a certain thing that is in the code, but we can take it into account when we're considering compliance. So we want to see that you're meeting sort of the spirit of the code and, your intention is to meet what is in the standards, absolutely. But the code will be helpful in that regard, I think, in terms of elaborating what we mean and giving you some clarity on what that might look like in practice. Alongside those documents, we've also carried out an impact assessment. So what is the impact of us introducing new standards? And we've also been mindful of our public sector equality duty in developing these revised standards. And so those documents are also open for consultation as well. They are reasonably weighty documents, and I recognise the package as a whole is reasonably weighty, but we have put a lot of thought into making sure that the standards are not unreasonably discriminating against certain groups of people, that it's not having a negative impact on people with protected characteristics or other groups of tenants. And we are really open to your views on that as well. So they are there, and in the consultation there are questions about the regulatory impact assessment and also the EQIA that we have produced. So please do, if you've got the chance, please do have a look at those documents as well and give your feedback on them. So as Donna said, there's quite a lot in this consultation. So there are the draft consumer standards, draft code of practice, draft regulatory impact assessment, equality impact assessment, and we've also provided a plain English summary and an easy read summary as well, which is really just about trying to increase accessibility of the documents, particularly given how many of them there are. That is a lot, as I say. I'm aware that that is quite a lot of material for people to cover. What we want is for people to engage with all of it. It's all important. It's all important for us to get feedback on. So if you have got the time, please do make the time to look through all of those documents and give us as much feedback as you can, because it really will be welcome and it really will strengthen where we go in future. So a little bit then just on how you can take part. So the consultation documents are on our webpage, and you can see the summary and the plain English summary there as well. There are, as Donna said, 9 questions in the consultation document itself. You don't have to answer everyone. We would like it if you did, but you don't have to if you want to limit yourself in some way. But the more feedback we get, the better. So we're really open to as much feedback, as I say, as you want to provide, in whatever form you want to provide it. So please do engage with those questions and give us your thoughts and your views. Our preferred method is online, that you'd respond online, but we have an email address that you can see on the webpage, and we also have a postal address to our Leeds office as well. So if they work better for you, or anyone else that you're engaging with, if they work better for your tenants, that is absolutely fine. And I think when we did the tenant satisfaction measure consultation, we really encouraged landlords to talk to their tenants about it before they responded, to encourage their tenants to respond, or to hear what their tenants had to say before the landlords responded as well. So we are, like I say, really open to that feedback. We want to hear from landlords and tenants and from other people who have an interest in it. The more feedback we get, the more credible I think the outcome will be at the end. And I talked earlier about the importance of having we talked earlier about the importance of having something that is regulatable for us, but also that makes a meaningful difference for tenants and that landlords can deliver. So we really do want to hear if that's what these standards are achieving, and if they aren't, then we want to have a look at that and make these standards as good as they possibly can be. So please do think about that and give us, as much feedback as you can give us would be really welcome. So just very briefly on next steps. So this is a 12-week consultation. We were really keen to do 12 weeks. Things were looking a bit tight sometimes when we were waiting for the legislation to come out, but because we want it to be such a meaningful consultation, we wanted to give people the full 12 weeks to respond. So please do have a look. So it went live on Tuesday. The consultation closes in October, at which point we will carry out a fairly significant piece of analysis, looking at recommendations as well. We have staff already waiting for the responses and to do the analysis. So the more responses we get, the better. And then from early in 2024, probably around February, I think you could expect us to publish the final version of the standards based on the consultation and the code of practice, and there'll be a decision statement that goes with that says how we considered all of the feedback that you provided, what changes we've made, maybe where we haven't made changes, the reasons for that, but really just to explain how we considered all of the information that we got. And then from April 2024, as I've said, is when the new regime goes live and when we'll be implementing and regulating against those standards. Directions to follow. Donna touched on this earlier. I won't spend a great deal of time, but really this is the parts of the jigsaw puzzle that aren't quite there yet. So these are the bits that we are expecting to be directed on by government. And when they do, that will result in some additional changes to the standards that we will have to regulate against. But you'll be aware there are going to be some competence and conduct requirements, sometimes known as professionalisation, what kind of qualifications housing staff have to have and how they need to behave. So there'll be something about that goes into the standards. Awab's law, really following on from the death of Awab Ishak and the findings of the inquest in late 2022, really intended to give tenants information about how they can get hazards in their homes, so things like damp and mold, but other hazards too, addressed within a certain timescale, and to get landlords to provide information to tenants on their rights. And there will also be more to follow on the decent home standard I've already mentioned, requirements around energy efficiency as well for the sector, new directions on tenure we're expecting from government, and also the access to information scheme as well. So there are still quite a few bits to follow in terms of the different elements that we're waiting for, and there'll be some further changes to the standards as a result. But we think what is in there, will be the bulk of the standards as they currently are, subject to the consultation responses that we get. And then I'm conscious of time and I want to allow time for conversation, but I did just want to touch a little bit on pilot inspections as well, just to give you some context, I suppose, for what us implementing these standards might look like in practice for you and your organisations. So we've been doing some pilot inspections of the new model, thinking about the different approaches that we might take and what that might look like. And that is still a bit of a work in progress, but we do know some things that are pretty likely to appear in the new model. So our focus really in the pilot inspections have been on two broad areas: service outcomes and accountability. So service outcomes is anything that is sort of the service you provide on the ground to your tenants. So things like decency, the quality of accommodation, your repairs service, how you manage antisocial behaviour, that kind of thing. So whatever services tenants receive from you and how that feels to tenants. So that will have really close links with the safety and quality standard, the neighbourhood and community standard, and the tenancy standard. And the second broad area is around accountability, which is really about any interaction and engagement that you're having with your tenants and what that looks like. So really close link there with the transparency, influence and accountability standard. So thinking about how you respond to complaints, what voice tenants have within your organisation, whether you're treating your tenants with fairness and respect. So those are the two broad outcomes that we have been looking at. For those of you who operate in private registered providers, some of the methodology that we use might feel familiar if you've already gone through an in-depth assessment. For local authorities, it will probably feel quite different because we've not been, until this stage, been proactive around how we assess compliance, local authorities' compliance with the consumer standards. So our focus is on key risks. We do that already with our in-depth assessments. You can expect us to continue that, but those key risks will be expanded to consider things like the services that you provide to tenants, risks to tenants from poor quality accommodation, risks to tenants from things like domestic abuse and antisocial behaviour. So we'll focus on key risks. We'll do a scoping exercise that will try and identify those key risks as well. You can expect us to do a document review. We'll ask you for evidence that you're meeting the standards and your assurance that you're meeting the standards. So there'll be a desktop element to it, and we'll review the documentation you provide. And then we'll move on to meeting observations and coming what we would describe as on-site work. So meeting observations. And for private registered providers already, what we would usually do would be to expect to meet with your board and to observe your board, and then other decision-making bodies as well. What we've done through the pilot inspections, and I think what will continue, is some flexibility around what meetings we observe. And really what we're looking to see is where your services to tenants are, where decisions are made about those services. So that might be an operations committee or a service committee or something like that. So we might expand on the observations that we do. And similarly, we will interview your senior staff, and for local authorities, we will interview relevant councillors as well. So a slight expansion there, because again, we'll focus on some of the service outcomes and how you're engaging with tenants. And for councillors as well, that is the equivalent of a board and a private registered provider. So we'll want to meet with perhaps a portfolio holder or a lead member or something like that. And I think the big difference through this work is engagement with tenants as well. So we've been trying a range of different ways of engaging with tenants. Some of your engaged residents in particular, if you've got a scrutiny committee or something like that, has been a real feature of our work. But we've tested other things as well, and I think we'll want to keep those as options. So things like carrying out a focus group or carrying out a survey. We've done estate walkabouts in some cases. And like I say, what we're trying to develop is a toolkit for how we engage with tenants and get the insight that tenants want to offer us. And if I could just offer a few lessons in terms of what we've seen and for things that you might want to think about. Really, I would encourage you to think about how you evidence your outcomes and compliance. So I think the sector as a whole has got pretty good at evidencing things like your decency, statutory health and safety compliance. Some areas where maybe you aren't tested as often, providers have sometimes struggled a little bit with in giving us the evidence. So things like around how your allocations policy is working, how your interventions around antisocial behaviour is working. So please do have a think about how you can evidence your compliance. making sure you've got good governance structures in place to demonstrate those outcomes. And that includes for local authorities. So we won't make a finding about your governance for local authorities because we haven't got remit there. We will for private registered providers, but you need good governance in place in order to deliver these outcomes. So please do make sure that your structures support you in doing that, and that you've got clear lines of reporting, you've got good oversight and clear accountability as well. One of the things that we talk about a lot is the data that you hold and the quality of the data that you hold. Please do have a think about whether that gives you what you need. So by that, I mean data on your stock, and for reasons that we've already talked about in the presentation, that will become more important during our inspections, but also the information you hold on your tenants as well. And I think then thinking about the accountability mechanisms that you've got, so how you're engaging with tenants and how you hear the voice of your tenants as well. So, and making sure you've got a good complaints process in place, but also tenants, even if they don't complain, are a really good source of information, and they will be the first people to know if something's going wrong. So making sure that you've got those mechanisms to hear what tenants are telling you, and that you can hear that at all levels in your organisation. So staff who are delivering the services, right up through your teams, up to your executive team and to your board as well. Making sure you can hear the voice of your tenants is really critical. So please do just have a think about those lessons in the context of the standards as they are, and particularly in thinking about that as you respond to the consultation as well. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was brilliant. I always like to think these sessions are, really a really good tool, because you really want to reach as many. And say we've got a massive turnout today. You really want to reach as many people as possible to make it meaningful, and hopefully, it's really nice for us to be able to have people that can put some questions to you direct. But I'm going to give you 1 minute to catch your breath and have a look at some of the questions. We've got quite a few. I'm just going to pick up on one to give you the chance to have a look. So I've got a question here, which I think is really timely. So the new Act gives the Housing Ombudsman the powers to issue guidance relating to services that come within the scope of their remit. The guidance will only be used in the context of the Housing Ombudsman investigating a complaint. However, no doubt it will become very significant. How will this guidance intersect with the new consumer standards, and what status will it have in the eyes of the regulator? So I'm going to pick up on this, and Angela, I don't know if you're going to be able to offer an opinion on this, because it is a little bit off bold of what we're talking about when we're thinking about the standards, although, there are, the complaint standards have been updated to make sure. I think what I'm going to pick up on here is this is a really pertinent issue for landlords at the minute, and I am dealing with a lot of inquiries relating to individual investigations and para 49s, and increasing concern from landlords where they don't know where the boundary lies presently between the Ombudsman and the regulator, and some concerns that I think in some cases maybe the Ombudsman is making findings or decisions that may go beyond the scope of the scheme. My view on this, because everything at the moment, there's a volume of understanding, is that the intention of the legislation is to give clearer demarcation between the two, so that landlords can have greater clarity. And I also note that the Ombudsman has to consult with the regulator when they're actually putting the code together. So I think the intention is we should have a clearer picture at the end of this than we do presently. But I picked that one out because that has been a real issue that I've been dealing with, pretty much every day for the last, couple of months, varying inquiries about the Ombudsman and investigations. But Andrew, I won't put you on the spot, but if there was anything to add, I'll give you the opportunity now.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to talk in broad terms. I think from our perspective, we're really conscious about that landscape and making sure that we don't overlap, and that boundary between us as a regulator and the Housing Ombudsman. We work really closely with the Housing Ombudsman, and one of the things that has come through in the legislation, actually, with the bill being given royal assent the other week, is the requirement for us to have a memorandum of understanding that puts on a statutory footing. So we have already got an MOU with the Housing Ombudsman, but we are looking at that again, and we are hoping that we'll have a new MOU in place at the time that the new regime goes live, which will hopefully give a bit more detail, in particular about the separation between the two organisations, where we'll share information across our two organisations and how we'll work together. So I recognise that this is sort of a live issue, but I'm hoping that we'll have more detail, and that will be in the public domain at the time that this new bill goes live.
Yeah, I think that is the thing, isn't it? The key to this is clearly there's going to be more detail to follow, and the outcome of this must be more transparency for all involved and a clearer line. So that's great. So I had one or two questions put in advance, but hopefully you've had a chance to look at some of the ones that have come in, but I'll just pop one of them to you now. Someone's asked me, we would love to hear your view on the likely demands on the access to information scheme, hoping there won't be a flood of requests made under the scheme. I understand this was the case when something similar was rolled out in Scotland. I mean, unfortunately, any new powers or any new schemes will often attract an initial peak response, but certainly I think it would be anticipated that when that scheme comes out, that would be a likely consequence.
Yeah, I think so. I haven't got any details in terms of figures or what kind of impact that might be. And partly because of the limitations of our role around it as well. So as a regulator, we won't be sort of arbitrating in those discussions that tenants or others might have with their landlords in accessing information. Although we will want to see that there is a process in place to respond and meet the requirements of the access to information scheme. But I think I would expect that it will have some burden on registered providers, that and really the intention behind it isn't to generate a flurry of work, but it is to give tenants access to information in order to improve that landlord-tenant relationship and to enable them to hold their landlord to account. So I would expect an increase, but it's very difficult at this point for us to estimate what that might look like.
And then the other question that I had was, what do you see as the big changes from the current position and risks? Is there going to be a requirement to inspect every home that we have under management?
Yeah, I mean, that is probably the biggest change that I think is coming from these draft standards. Certainly that's the biggest change that we've proposed. For obvious reasons, I know the sector has got varying approaches to stock condition and doing their stock condition work, including the use of cloning and things as well. But I think really what has come out from the various tragic incidents that have happened in social housing over the years, it's really the importance of landlords understanding their stock. So we have emphasised that in the safety and quality standard. That is probably the most significant change in there. I think the other big change is maybe not a change in requirements necessarily, or not too detailed by way of changes in requirements, but more the emphasis around that engagement with tenants as well is probably a significant change for us in terms of how you might expect us to talk to you about it and our expectations around that as well. So we will really want to see good evidence that you're engaging with your tenants, that tenants have a say in how things are run, that you've got mechanisms to hear what tenants are saying to you at all stages in your organisation. So, I mean, those requirements are already in our current standards, and they are slightly different, but are in the revised standards as well. But that will be the big change, I think, in emphasis that we're expecting to see more of that in our inspections as well.
Seen questions that you want to pick up on from the question box?
Yeah, shall I do that? There's been quite a few, so I'll try and be reasonably brief and get through as many of them as I can. So there's some questions about timelines. So there's a question on if we have any timelines on when the directions will be coming out. So those are the directions that we get from government around other things that we need to include in our standards. I have quite limited information about that, I'm afraid, and I'm conscious that different ones will run to slightly different timescales. I don't think we're expecting anything before sort of September, October time. but that is not in our gift, so they will come to us when we're ready. When they're ready, we have done quite a bit of planning on different elements of it and what would happen in terms of timescales, but we'll just have to wait and see when they come out. There's also been a few questions sort of about what inspections would look like in the new world. So I just wanted to pause on some of that. So there's a question about, will the regulator be producing a framework for inspections before the regime begins? And then there's a question about how we'll prioritise inspections as well. So yes, there will be a framework for inspections. For the exact same reason, as I said, we don't want to set the sector up to fail. The intention is this isn't a test. It is intended to look and scrutinise what you're doing and what you're delivering, but we don't want that to be a secret, you know, about how we do it. It's not a test for you to pass. We just want to come and look at the services that you're delivering. So there will be a framework. I mean, at the minute, we put our information about how we do our in-depth assessments into regulating the standards. You could expect a similar document. I don't know whether it will be called regulating the standards yet, but there will be information in there in a similar type document about how we will do these inspections, what they'll look like, what you need to prepare for as well. On the point about how inspections will be prioritised, so yeah, previously in-depth assessments have been carried out generally every 4 years, a few more frequently. I'm not anticipating any significant changes to the prioritisation of inspections at this point. The legislation requires us to aim to do a full programme of inspections, including local authority inspections, over a 4-year period. So that's what we're working on, the basis that inspections will be generally every 4 years. There might be a small number that we do more frequently, but generally every 4 years. We are required to publish an inspection plan as well. So that plan won't sort of list every provider that we're intending to inspect in a year or anything like that, but it will set out the principles by which we will prioritise different organisations for an in-depth assessment and for an inspection, and so that information will be publicly available as well. I'm just going to pause there for a second and see, Donna, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add to any of that, or if not, I'll just pick up some.
No, I think the only thing I would add, I suppose, is a bit of a plug, really. I think what we will do is, you know, we're well aware that local authorities, this is, you know, a whole new world, and we will be running some tailored sessions for our local authority clients, where I think we will take a more holistic approach once we have more detail towards the end of this year, to give them a real sort of guide to not just the standards and what they mean, but actually the inspections process as well. So watch this space, because I think for councils it is a much more significant change than for PRPs.
Yeah, thank you. And there's a similar question along a similar line that I'll pick up as well, that talks about what will it feel like when we're doing these inspections for private registered providers? Will they feel like a single inspection when they're combined with an in-depth assessment, or will they feel like two separate elements? We are really keen that it feels like a single inspection. So you will get a small team of regulators who will come. We would expect them to be able to cover governance, consumer standards, financial viability, and it should feel like a rounded assessment. We've worked really hard on that in the pilots, and the feedback we've had from providers through the pilots are that it does feel joined up. From our perspective, it is entirely logical that the two things are joined together because they're so closely linked. So I'm hoping that you will feel the same. Just a couple of questions on the standards themselves and on the draft standards. So there's a question about whether the transparency, influence and accountability standard will replace the TSM standard. In short, yes. If you have a look at it as it is drafted currently, the requirements that are in our current TSM standard are sort of imported in to the transparency, influence and accountability standard. So in the specific expectations part of that standard are generally the requirements around tenant satisfaction measures. So it will be replaced, but the requirements themselves still exist. They're just in a slightly different place. Just have a quick scan through and see. There's a question about whether decent homes work refusals will mean that an organisation is still compliant, or will it impact on an organisation's compliance going forward? Currently, they are excluded. So if a tenant refuses to have decent homes works carried out, you don't count them in your non-decent figures. I can't say for certain because we don't own that decent home standard as it will currently look. I think our expectation is yes, that will be maintained, but that is really a question for government about whether they want to keep doing that as well.
Yeah, it's part of the maze of these things, isn't it? Sometimes people know what they have to do, but they're not. You wouldn't be entirely sure where the source of it is. And decent homes has been a really interesting one for me, looking at damp and mould and reporting, and you're not asked to report on the question, do you have any category 1 or category 2 hazards? However, you are asked to report on decent homes compliance, and if a property has a category 1 hazard, it's not decent homes compliant unless the tenant is not letting you in to do the work. So yeah, so that will be part of the decent homes review. The outcome, if the outcome of that is still the same in relation to works and that being an exemption, then that will just feed through, won't it?
Yeah,
it's like trying to find the source of these things sometimes is so that's out of your power, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I mean, ultimately it's for government to decide what they put into that document. We're talking to them about it, but it's their standard, and we will regulate against what we're asked to. But I'm hoping it won't be too much longer before the sector sees the decent homes standard, revised decent home standard. I've got one question here about quite a specific question about what percentage of tenant engagement was covered tenants living in supported accommodation, and particularly those who need to rely on appointees due to a lack of capacity. And I thought it was just helpful just to pick that up. I'm afraid I haven't got a percentage for you, but we have been really mindful about trying to reach as many tenants as we can, and going through existing structures to do that. So it depends on the organisations. Some of what we have done as part of our tenant engagement has been to go through registered providers and their existing involved resident structures. So we've done hosted events where involved residents have attended. Some of that has covered tenants in supported accommodation as well, and sometimes different organisations have different arrangements, but sometimes there are specific involved residents in supported accommodation schemes. So we have met with them through that. We've also done some quite open engagement, sort of webinars and meet the regulator and that kind of thing. And we've asked registered providers to publicise that. So that should have covered tenants in supported accommodation, and particularly if there are capacity issues, that should have also reached, appointees and other representatives as well. I suspect we can always do more to expand the reach of that. We've got some tenant engagement managers going to come to work with us and really try and think about how we reach as broad a range of tenants as possible. So we'll keep working on that, absolutely.
And I think that's an interesting point to pick up, is it's almost mirrored through the draft standards, and the code is looking at resident engagement for and there is actually a much greater emphasis and more detail about landlords changing their approaches for different residents and taking into account vulnerabilities and disabilities. And, I think we work on the same basis, I suppose, that the regulator would ask not more for the landlord than it would do for itself in canvassing their own consultation processes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the consultation includes the easy read questions and the easy read summary as well. So we are really trying to reach a diverse, and all of our consultation materials are available in other formats and things as well, and that's on the website. So, we want, as I've said throughout, we do want the consultation to be meaningful, and we do want it to be accessible to a diverse range of tenants and to hear from different tenants with different experiences as well. So we are really mindful of that. I think I've got through most of the questions, but there are a couple. If you don't mind, if I've got time just for one other.
Yeah, feel free.
There are a couple of questions about governance arrangements in local authorities. So in particular, considering when councils are designing governance arrangements, how do they best hear from tenants, and what's the role of tenant consultation in that? And a linked question about examples of good governance structures in local authorities, and particularly the role of overview and scrutiny as well. So I just wanted to pick those up. I think from our perspective, this is a difficult area because, as I say, we don't regulate a local authority's governance, but we do see in cases that we deal with even now, when things have gone wrong, inevitably there is an issue with the governance of the organisation. So, and we would really encourage councils to look at their governance arrangements. I think where we see things that are going really well, there is a really clear line of reporting and responsibility up from the staff on the ground who are delivering whatever service it is in question, right through the organisation and up to, and sometimes this is where we see weaknesses, up to and involving your leadership structure and your elected officials within that as well. So right through to cabinet and, or, you know, wherever decisions are made at councillor level. We have seen in the pilot sort of a gap at that level, maybe where cabinet aren't seeing the outcomes, or they maybe get reporting every 6 months or once a year or something like that. And if you think about that being the equivalent of a board in a private registered provider, they're probably seeing you know, that kind of performance reporting on a monthly basis, at least every 3 months, but increasingly on a monthly basis, if not more frequently. So making sure that you've got that really clear line right through the organisation, and making sure that there's consistency of reporting. Sometimes when you see local authorities with committee structures, sometimes you find that the reporting is maybe a bit uneven, that some reports go to some committees and then a slightly different report goes to another committee, and your staff are having to pull two lots of data that are slightly different but probably tell you basically the same thing. So making sure there's consistency in those arrangements as well. The role of tenants in it, I think, is really important. I mean, I would talk about that all day. I think we want tenants to be involved. We want tenants to understand how their landlords are performing. And as I say, they will be the first to give you feedback when things aren't quite right. I think we have seen, and this isn't specific to local authorities actually, but some organisations struggling to think about designing what their tenant involvement structures look like and how they're embedded within the organisation. So in particular, if you've got a group of involved residents, how are you consulting with them? Are you giving them enough information? And in particular, is there a link from those tenants who are giving up their time and supporting the organisation through to senior levels at the organisation as well? Sometimes you speak to involved residents and they say, oh, well, it doesn't really make any difference. And actually being able to show that there is a direct link between what they are talking to you about and the issues that they're raising and what is happening over the, you know, where decisions are being made and what difference that they are making is really helpful. So being able to articulate that is something we'll probably look for as well. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Oh, I mean, look, 1 minute before. I like to get everyone off on time. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Angela, it's been so good to have you, and so helpful to sort of have you within days of the consultation coming out, because I think that will give everyone a much more informed position when they dive in. So thank you everyone for joining us. We had fantastic attendance today, lots of really interesting questions. We will be running, I think, certainly a follow-up roundtable, virtual roundtable. If anyone's interested in an in-person event in either our London, Leeds or Birmingham offices, that would be really good. I'm happy to put something together if some of you would like to meet in person. And also, I think we'll be running something tailored to local authorities, maybe a round table for local authorities before the consultation closes, but certainly something after to help you prepare for this new world. So I'm going to say thank you very much, Angela. Thank you to everyone who attended. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.